It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Damian this morning. On reading your bio, Damian, I'm absolutely fascinated by the prospect of learning to think like Sir Alex Ferguson, or to be able to change anything. So I'm, as someone who, I don't play a lot of sport, but I'm absolutely fascinated by watching sport. I really enjoy watching team sport in particular. So to understand a little bit more about the psychology of teams and how that relates to organisations, I am really looking forward to. So without further ado, Damian, off you go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula, and thanks, Anne. And thank you, everybody. Thanks for your patience in terms of bearing with us this morning, but equally, thank you for your enthusiasm and your willingness to attend today's session. If I just explain a little bit about who I am, it'll help put this session into some kind of context, if I may. My name's Damian Hughes, and I do a few different jobs. The main one I do is I work as a visiting professor of organisational psychology and change at Manchester Met University. So I look very much at how teams come together, how they form, and then how do they bear up under intense periods of pressure. The second job I do is I work as a consultant across a wide range of organisations, mainly in elite sport, looking at how they can introduce some of these same principles. And then the third job that I do is I co-host a podcast series called the High Performance Podcast, and I've written a few different books around these principles, and that's really what I wanted to share with you in today's session, if I may. What I wanted to do is share with you some research from a book that I worked on called The Winning Mindset. I don't know if we've got any chance of it appearing on the screen, but I'll give you a really simple acronym around, or some context around this. I was asked to go and spend 3 years traveling the world, going around elite environments, looking at the common traits that these environments possessed. What was it that created high performance? And what I found over the course of it was that there was 5 characteristics that were consistently present when high performance followed. Now, the brilliant thing is that all of these principles are nothing to do with sport. They're to do with human beings coming together for a common aim. So if you've ever had the challenge of trying to get a diverse group of people to behave cohesively, deliver a message that people remember many months after you've delivered that message, or get people to cope particularly well under pressure, these are all the same challenges that sport just seems to accelerate and amplify. And what I saw was how the individuals within it managed to sustain this consistent high performance. So what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit of that research around it. If we start at the very start of this, though, I'd like to, the first guy I went to interview was a guy called Freddie Roach. Now, Freddie Roach is based out in Los Angeles. He's a famous boxing coach. But he's a man that's intrigued me for a long time, because not only has he been incredibly successful, he's done so while battling the debilitating impacts of Parkinson's disease. So many people that don't know him, for example, often assume that he's drunk because of the slurred speech or the shakes. But the reality is he's building incredibly strong, deep, powerful relationships with people that then subsequently go on to trust him. So I was fortunate to spend 3 days with him. And when I asked him the question in his office, how do you do what you do? He tried to explain, but we were struggling, if I'm honest, to get some common ground. And then he said to me, you know what, it's probably easier if I can show you. So he gave me a pen and a piece of paper, and he gave me the instructions to draw a picture. Now, I was wondering whether you wanted to start today's session by doing the same exercise that I did that particular afternoon in Los Angeles with Freddie Roach. So the challenge that he gave me, and again, if you've got a pen and piece of paper to hand, you might want to join in with this, was he asked me to draw a picture of a coffee mug. So I'll give you 30 seconds to draw for me now your best interpretation of a mug of coffee. And then, if you're doing it, hold it up to the camera so we can have a look at your interpretations of it. Cool. So we've seen Paula's version of it there. Great. I think it's fair to say, Paula, that artistic talent isn't necessarily a prerequisite to working in an HRA.
Absolutely.
Anne's enthusiastic on there with the steam coming off it. Very good. Well, the purpose behind it was, I'll show you if we can get this up. I don't know. Are you able to see any visuals?
Yeah, we saw the picture earlier, Damian. Yes,
Okay,
we can
yeah.
see.
So here's my version of that coffee mug. I don't know if it's there on the screen for you, but it's similar to the two that I saw there from Anne and Paula. Now, what I would ask you to do is hold on to that picture of a coffee mug for me, because it became a really powerful metaphor for how high performance occurs. But I'll explain why at the end. What I did find was there was some common characteristics that kept appearing when high performance followed. And to make it easy for you, I put it into an acronym that I call STEPS. And the reason I wanted to put it into an acronym is because I want this to almost serve as a mental inventory, or a shopping list, if you like, where if you're not getting the results that you want through the relationships with others, before we start to point the finger at anyone else, we begin by starting to go through these 5 steps and work out where do we maybe need to sharpen our own individual focus. So we'll take them in turn, if you'll permit me. So the first and most obvious of all the steps that we describe is this: simplicity, which is far easier to say than it is to do. Let me give you some stats why. We know that you're required that in the next hour that we're going to spend in each other's company, you're going to receive on average around 37 interruptions by your smartphone device that's sat somewhere close to you at this moment in time. Whether that's a phone call, an email, a text message, a social media post, you're going to be interrupted 37 times in an average 60-minute day. Now, what we know is that if you allow yourself to be distracted just one of those 37 occasions, it will take you on average around 22 minutes to get your levels of focus back to where they were before you picked up that message. So we know in many ways that smart technology makes us stupid. And there's lots of medical evidence that started to come to the fore since the rise of smartphones. We've noticed, for example, neuroscientists refer to a condition known as ADT, attention deficit trait. Now, that's the occasion when you find yourself occasionally at work looking around thinking, is it me, or is common sense not always common practice? But when you're rushing from one phone call to another, when your phone's ringing, your email's pinging, somebody's asking you for 2 minutes of the time, ADT suggests that our IQ levels diminish on average by between 15 and 20 points. There's another condition known as nomophobia, which is the terror we have when we don't get access to our mobile phone and messages. So there's a research from Dr. John Cotter, the Harvard psychologist, who studied the average life of a Western world employee. And what he found is, in an average 3-month period, you receive around 2.3 million bits of data and information from the trust direct to your head. Whether that's the form of a webinar like this, a team meeting, an office notice board, you receive on average 2.3 million bits of information every 3 months. The question Dr. John Cotter asked was, how much of that information is centered around a single, simple, coherent and consistent message? And the research there suggested it's around 13,400. Or if we put it in percentage terms, that's just over 0.5% of our the deluge of information fighting for our attention is ever around a single message. So we need to understand that in a world of almost constant sensory overload, our ability to cut through the noise and make things simple and digestible becomes increasingly relevant. And this was really brought to the fore when I was fortunate enough to interview Sir Alex Ferguson when he was at Manchester United. The question I asked him was, what did he regard as the difference between a good and a great leader? And again, similar to Freddie Roach in Los Angeles, he was better at illustrating it rather than explaining it. And the way he did it was he took a tennis ball. He made me stand up and he threw the ball to me. He said, catch that. I did. He said, how was it? I said, it was easy. So he took 2 balls and threw them in the air at the same time, with the instruction to catch them both. Then he did it with 3, then 4, and then finally 5. And on the last occasion, I struggled to catch 1. Ferguson's point was that, in a nutshell, is a difference between a good and a great leader. What a good leader would do, he asserted, was that they would walk into a room and throw as much information at you in the hope that some of it might stick. What a great leader would do, he suggested, was that before they walked in that room, they'd work out not how many balls can I throw, but how many can an individual catch. And they would therefore prioritise what they regarded as the most important of all the information. Now, as I said to you, these principles are not exclusive to sport, far from it. And this was brought home really neatly for me when I was in the States. I went to interview a couple of guys that were doing a similar project to me, but they were immersed in a completely different industry. They were immersed in Hollywood. And what they were looking at was, how does a writer get a brilliant idea out of their head onto the screen of your local cinema? And they tracked the process for the 3 years that it traditionally the process tended to last. And what they found was the writers that consistently got their films made weren't the most creative, the innovative, the richest, or the most resourceful. They were the ones that kept things simple. And as is the way in Hollywood, they gave it a brilliant acronym. They said that the best writers could bluff. And the bluff in this case stood for, whenever they communicated their film idea, they would give you the bottom line up front. All of their meetings started with the basic premise of what the film was about. Now, I thought we'd have a bit of fun with this morning, and I thought I'd give you some genuine bluffs that have been used in Hollywood and see if you can guess the films that were made as a consequence. So again, I don't know if you can see the screen here, but if not, I'll read it out loud. But we'll start with the first one. And if you want to unmute your microphone, just shout out, what film do you think this is describing? Jaws on a spaceship. Any guesses?
I think if people are putting it in the chat, Damian. So we've got Alien. Okay. We've got Alien. We've got Snakes on a Plane. We've got Independence Day.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, I'm seeing this. Right. Great. Thank you. Sorry, I've just recognised it. Kerry, Jack, Danny. Oh, yep. You're absolutely right. The answer to that is Alien. I'll give you another one then. Die Hard on a Bus. Who's first off the chat with that? Oh, Jack's quick on that. Kerry is, Danny is as well. Nicola, Margie. Yeah, you're all right. The answer to that is indeed Speed. Now, before you get too smug, let me tell you that film is 29 years old this year. If that doesn't make you feel old, I don't know what does. Next one. This is an easy one. James Bond with a hat and a whip. You've all got the answer to that is Indiana Jones. There's a lovely story associated with this. It's Steven Spielberg recounts it. Spielberg's ambition was to make a Bond film, and he applied to do Octopussy in the late 1970s, and he got rejected, and shortly afterwards he was complaining about it with his friend George Lucas, who then suggested that why don't we just remake James Bond but give them a hat and a whip instead. And they took just that one simple idea and pitched it to Hollywood, and the whole trilogy was subsequently greenlit. Now, what I love about Hollywood is sometimes they don't even bother to change their bluff title when it comes to marketing it to the general public. Now, you can't complain that you didn't know what that film was about. Snakes on a Plane. So what I wanted to show you is that simplicity isn't about assuming that people are simple. It's the opposite. I'd argue it's a great illustration of the famous Leonardo da Vinci quote that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Most people are smart. Give them the information in a way they can receive and do something with. They can therefore be able to make smart decisions. And I thought we'd illustrate this by playing another game based on this Hollywood metaphor. Let's assume that on this webinar today, right, our task is to make a film. Now you say to me, what's the film about? And I don't know, I can only give you the bluff. 5 words, Die Hard on a Plane. But we've all got different roles to play to make this movie a reality. Some of us are going to be involved in the marketing of it. Some of us are going to be involved in the HR and recruitment aspects of our task. And some of us are going to be in the finance department. We're going to have to raise money. So let's start by looking at it from the finance perspective. If you're going to make Die Hard on a plane, do you think you're going to have to raise around $10 million to get this movie greenlit? Or do you think it's more likely to be in the region of 100 million? Again, just give us your answers in the chat function there. So we're starting to see there that a number of you are responding quickly. Thanks, Sean, Sarah, Kerry, Georgia, Clavicia, thank you. But we're starting to see the vast majority of us there are recognising that we probably need to raise somewhere in the region of $100 million. So we're already getting a general consensus based on just 5 words of information. If you're in HR, do you think we're going to have to recruit a superstar whose name alone can carry the movie? Or do you think we might get away with recruiting an ensemble cast of relative unknowns instead? Star or ensemble? What do you think we're going to have to do for recruitment? So again, Clavicia, Nicola, Margie, Rachel, Claire, we're all coming up with the same answer. Of course, it seems obvious that we're going to go for the star. If you're a marketeer, are you going to look for drama or action specialists to make this movie appeal to the general public? The answer, as Margie, as Anne, as Nicola, as Jack have all agreed, is about you go for an action specialist. So the question's almost an insult to your intelligence, but rather than take offence to that, the question we should be asking is, why is it so obvious? And the reason is because we've invested time in crafting the message that we want everybody to walk away and share that same objective for. So the first point I want to emphasize to us all again is this idea that we need to focus on keeping our message simple and therefore actionable. Which brings us to the second part of our acronym, the role of thinking, which again is a really easy thing to say, but isn't always so easy to implement. Let me explain why not by giving you some simple stats. You're required to make on average about 10,000 decisions every single day. We know that out of those 10,000 decisions, approximately 236 of them are concerned simply with food and drink. And if you don't believe me, let me give you a really simple example to illustrate the point. Imagine your next visit to any posh coffee shop anywhere near where you live, and think about the amount of decisions that you're required to make from the moment you arrive through the doors to leaving with a drink in your hand. Because it's not as simple as just turning up and asking for a brew. You arrive there, they want to know what size cup do you want. Then you've got to decide, is there a type of coffee bean you'd like? Then is there a style you want the coffee made in? After that, you want milk with it. If you do, is it going to be skim, semi, full fat, almond, soya, or maybe none at all? After that, you've then got to decide, is it going to be syrup, sweeteners, or sugars? If so, which ones? And that's even before you decide whether you're going to give them your real name at the end of it or not. So what do? Just order the same drink every time. I'll have a latte, please. Because your brain doesn't like thinking. Your brain likes the path of least resistance. So once you've made a decision, it doesn't want to deliberate too often. These are referred to in psychology as heuristics. They're like mental models, rules of thumb. And the vast majority of these heuristics have worked well for you. That's why you're on a call like this, because you're smart, intelligent people. You're successful. The trouble is, what happens when these heuristics stop working? And this is where people find change difficult. This is where, when things are not as you expect, people will say to you, it's not like it used to be here. Back in the day, it was different. Do you ever hear that conversation where people say that kids are different these days? Can I encourage you, don't ever let a comment like that pass without a challenge. When people say that kids are different these days, stop and say, compared to when? Just that simple response forces people to stop and think, and they'll go, well, when I was a kid. And the reality is that might have been 50 years previously. So obviously society's changed, kids have responded to different conditions. So it's not that kids have changed or kids are different, society has changed. And the last time we thought about it was when we were a child ourselves. So you see how we get into these patterns where we don't like to invest too much time in reflection. Let me give you an example that you can play along with at home and show you how easy that we all fall into this trap of of acting without thinking. I'm going to put some letters up here on the screen, and I don't want you to unmute your microphone, but I do want you to play along with this just at home. So let's give it a go. I just want you to read out this information. So we'll start with the first one. Read it out loud. S. Next one, P. Next, O. And finally, T. What word does it spell? Spot. Say it again. Spot. And again. Spot. Faster. Spot. Louder. Spot. What do you do at green light? Now, if you just found yourself shouting, go, stop, you've just understood how heuristics work. Because you know as well as I do, you go at a green light. But we get into this pattern of hearing a similar sound and our brain just immediately switches off and stops thinking. So what's the point of this? Well, the answer is that this is the quietest skill in high-performing teams. You don't have to have the answers. What you do have to obsess about is creating an environment where people are asking questions. Let me explain why. When you ask a question, even when you're in that chat box today and you're making you're investing your faith enough to give me your answer, what's happening underneath the psychological surface is fascinating. The first thing is when somebody asks you a question, what they're doing is giving you the opportunity to build trust. They're going to ask you a question and they're going to trust that you're going to handle it in a discreet and sensitive way. You're not going to make a fool of them. You're not going to set them up for fall. You're not going to ridicule them for not knowing. So the first thing is you get the chance to establish trust. The second thing that follows is they give you the chance to demonstrate that this is a psychologically safe environment. A psychological safe environment has been famously studied by Amy Edmondson, the organisational psychologist that originally started her research in hospitals in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And what she discovered in her research was the best teams are psychologically safe. When people make a mistake, they hold their hands up and share it without worrying that they're going to be disciplined or made to feel ridiculous for doing so. So when somebody asks you a question, that's your chance to demonstrate that they're safe to do so. And that is where high performance occurs. So I thought we'd play a game that shows you how just creating that space for people to think instantly makes the thinker smarter. I don't know if you remember from TVs when you were a kid on Saturday night, there used to be the generation game on TV. Now, the host would change regularly, but the nature of the show never did. The item of the show most people recall is the conveyor belt, where items roll across it and your job is to remember as many of them as you can. Well, that's the game we're going to play here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 21 items on this conveyor belt, and your job is just play along at home, read out the name of each of the items as they appear. Then at the end of the session, I'm going to give you the chance to write down as many of them as you can recall. Now let me tell you where the catch is. Not all the items are going to be there. Some of them will be, some of them won't, and some of them are just going to be obscured. Now don't worry about that. I'll explain why at the end of it, but can you all see the screens? Is there any issue with the screens coming up for you before we start the conveyor belt rolling?
We can see it at the moment.
Okay, well, let's keep our fingers crossed, right? We'll get Bruce Forsyth singing, and your job is just read out the name of each of the items as they appear. Here we go. So start with TV. You go to me. Over to you.
Life is the name of the game, and I want to play the game with you. Life can be terribly tame if you don't play the game with two. Life is to go as you please, and I'd be so pleased to go with you. Life can be oh such a tease if you don't play the game with two.
Here's your last one. So hopefully you saw all of those. Oh, is it not moving? I've just seen the notes. So the video was frozen. It froze on car, stuck on one picture. Right, you'll remember that one. Oh, sorry. Could you hear Bruce Forsyth singing? At least you got a treat of that. The idea behind it, sorry, and we'll share it in a different way, is that The idea behind it is that some of the pictures were given to you, so your brain didn't have to do any thinking. Some of the pictures were obscured and some weren't there. So when you read it out loud, your brain had to fill in the gaps. And what we know is that most people remember the items where the gaps were because they had to work a little bit harder. The essence of the point, though, if we just dwell on that, is that you don't have to have the answers. You don't have to be the fount of all knowledge, but you can spend time creating an environment where people are asking questions, because that is where thinking occurs, which leads to high performance. And to the probably what I would regard as the biggest part of the research for this, the role of emotional intelligence. Now, I'm conscious emotional intelligence is one of these buzzwords that comes around every so often in our organisations. People talk about how we go about developing it and improving it. If you permit me, what I'd like to do is share with you a story from the most emotionally intelligent environment I went to visit. And then I'd like to take a 2-minute detour into the world of evolutionary psychology to explain why it works. The environment that I went to that I'd categorise as the best in this field was actually the most incongruous. I don't know if any of you have been to Detroit in the last decade or so. It doesn't tend to crop up on many people's bucket lists because it's quite a gritty urban working city. But I was going there and I ended up going to the poorest part of that city to go and visit this boxing gym called the Kronk Gym. Now, the reason I wanted to go is this was a place that was regarded as a greenhouse of just pure undiluted talent. The track record of sustained success was incredible. But to get there, I had to go through areas that were blighted by drugs and gangs and crime and all other different factors like that. And I found it intimidating. So when I first arrived in this gym, the man that headed it up for many years was a man called Manuel Stewart. He was waiting for me. And he was incredibly warm and effusive. "Damian, how are you doing? It's great that you're finally here. How are you feeling?" was his opening line. And I thought that was a really nice, enthusiastic welcome. So I tried to mirror it. He said, "Manny, I'm fantastic. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me here. I can't wait to spend the next few days in your company." And he let me finish. And then he said, "That's really kind." He said, "Now, would you mind telling me the truth?" He said, "How do you really feel?" Now, I don't know if you've ever had verbal diarrhea. You know, those experiences where your mouth talks independently of your brain. Well, that's what happened to me next. I found myself stood in front of this man I'd long admired and started babbling. I started saying to him, "To be honest, I'm knackered. I know you're busy. I don't want to be in your way. I'll stay here in the corner. I'm really sorry that I want to be a nuisance to you." And I just started talking like that. And he let me finish that. And then he said, "Thank you for being honest." He said, "That now means we can work together." He said, "You stay with me. I want to take care of you." Now, when I got to know him a little bit better, I went back to my very first visit with him and I said to him, "Manny, can I ask you a question?" He said, "Sure, ask anything you like." I said, "That first morning I met you, why did you feel a need after you asked me how I felt to tell the truth?" I said, it was an interesting response. He said, "I always ask the second question." He said, "The second question is when our relationship actually began." I said, "Would you explain more?" He said, "Sure." He said, "When you arrived in my gym," he said, "I saw a nervous looking white English guy turning up here." He said, "But the words you were telling me didn't match the picture. You were telling me how excited you were to be there." He said, "So that led me to one of two conclusions. The conclusions were you were either a liar or you were a sociopath." He said, "If I want to have you in my world, I need to know who's coming in." So the second question just accelerated the conversation. "How do you really feel?" And the answer you gave me on the second time told me you were telling lies. You were doing so through nerves and anxiety, but I reasoned that made you a decent person. He said, "But that second question is important for everybody." He said, "Every child that comes into my world feels the same way you do. Nervous, frightened, scared, intimidated, out of their depth, maybe a little bit afraid." He said, "Now I think I'm the best coach in the world, but I appreciate I can't coach you when those emotions are clouding your judgment." He said, "I work on a simple basis, and this simple basis is a 3-word summary of emotional intelligence that is worth you scribbling down." The 3 words Manny Stewart used were contain, then explain. Contain, then explain. What he means by that is I need to convince you that I care about you, that I see you, I value you, I'm interested, I hear you. And only then can I then explain how we're going to work together. He said, but what too many people try to do is they tell you what you've got to do, and only if you achieve it do they then pretend that they care about you. It doesn't work in that order. Now, the reason that's such a simple but quite profound message is worth us exploring a little bit in the language of evolutionary psychology. In really simple terms, if we think about two thinking systems that occupy our psychological brain, we'll refer to them in the simplest ways possible as red and blue. The red thinking system is what we share with every other animal on the planet. It's our limbic system and our brainstem, and it does three things for us. It gives us a sex drive, it gives us a desire to survive, and it gives us an instinct to hunt with people like us. So let's just go through them in turn. The sex drive idea is probably best illustrated if you ever watch any of the nature programs on TV. But our human ability gets relinquished to control this on three occasions. One, when we fall in love. Two, when we consume amounts of alcohol. But the third one is in the middle of the night. So if you ever find yourself waking up when you're in a deep sleep pattern, you'll notice your thoughts generally tend to be bleak and dark and overwhelming. And the reason for that is because the blood supply at that time of night is feeding up to your brainstem and being hijacked exclusively by it. And the reason your thoughts are bleak and dark or overwhelming is because the second function is it's designed to protect you. So when you sense that you're in a situation where you're not safe, where your survival might be compromised, this part of the brain offers you three really simple responses: run away, hide, or confront it, freeze, flight, or fight. Now, it's worth just pausing for a breath for a moment here and looking at what that means in relation to our modern day working environments. I'll give you some clues. If you're working in a team where you've got a high absence rate, you've got a flight response going on. Often something toxic is happening within that culture. Or if you've got a high attrition rate, people joining or leaving, there's some questions that need to be explored. Think about it when you were a kid at school, when you used to go to the classroom for a lesson that you didn't like. Where was your preferred position? As far back as you can. It's a flight response. It's like now as I'm talking to you. If we could see each other, I'd be looking for those of you that are distracted on phones or looking elsewhere, because that means that mentally you've legged it. So we're wasting each other's time in trying to engage. The freeze response we spoke about in the thinking element. This is where people appear to be apathetic, when the reality is they either don't feel safe or they don't trust the people they're working with. So they go into that head down, say nothing, just allow it to happen. The third response is aggression, cynicism, rudeness, abrasiveness, people being belligerent or horrible. That's just a fight response, sending a warning to others that don't mess with me, my bite might be worse than my bark. And what we know is any evidence of those behaviours is a surefire predictor of subsequent underperformance. You might say, oh, I do okay, but it's like arguing that a broken clock is right. It is twice a day, but it's an accident, not a design. The third function of our red brain is we hunt with others like us. And this is where it can often lead to cliques and internal politics and divisions. Really simple example to offer you is that if you ever hear people making criticisms of other colleagues elsewhere in the trust, senior management, useless, that department over there, a waste of time, that wing, rubbish. If you want to know whether those kind of conversations are acceptable, useful, or whether they're destructive and red-headed in their nature, try a really simple test. Change the level of management or the department that you're criticising for race or gender and see how socially acceptable the same conversation would be. You know as well as I do it's abhorrent. So what's going on when we choose to speak to people in that way? Well, what the red brain is doing in that situation is dehumanizing another group of people. You're making them different than you. They're not the same as you. They don't have the same issues I do. And once we've dehumanized them, it becomes really easy to delete, to distort, or to dismiss their messages. I didn't hear them say that. What they really meant to say was this. That isn't how I interpreted it. And that's where misinformation starts to come alive. So the contrast is the blue thinking system. This has got two agendas. The first agenda the blue thinking system does, this is your prefrontal cortex, by the way, is first of all, we've got a desire for logic, for order, for common sense. And when we don't have it, we make it up. This is where conspiracy theories occur. This is where gossip happens. We join together by stories. The second function is we have what we call a society agenda. And the society agenda says, how do we help each other? Back in 1948, when the health service was originated, a society agenda was at the heart of its very premise. How do we come into each other's company and leave feeling better? So the challenge is we need more blue and less red in our interactions. The problem is we're not wired that way. The red part of our brain is far more powerful and responsive than the blue, and I'll give you a quick test if we can get the screen up to illustrate it. Have a look at this information. Just recognize how long it takes you to spot the problem. Because it should take you around 2 seconds. But the reality is you've now been looking at it for nearly 10 seconds. And a number of you haven't spotted that it says 2 U's in the sentence above. Why? Because your red brain has been distracted by the bright shining numbers at the bottom. So this is where contain then explain becomes so important. It's about So contain and explain is so important for us. Think about when you go and visit a supermarket. Think about next time you go into it. Notice how they try to manipulate your red thinking system before they operate the blue. Notice how there's fresh flowers somewhere in the reception area of the supermarket. That doesn't make sense to your blue brain. But what it's going to convince your red brain is that everything in the supermarket is fresh, like those flowers you can see in the reception area. The first food aisle you'll always walk through, fruit and veg, which again doesn't make sense to your logical brain. They're items that will bruise at the bottom of your basket. But they're not selling to your blue brain at that stage. They're still trying to convince you that everything in that supermarket is fresh and healthy and nutritious, like the fruit and veg aisle you're walking through. The final thing to notice is it's called cognitive easing. The aisles in the fruit and veg aisle are always twice as wide as anywhere else in the store. It's a first welcoming impression that it looks like it's going to be spacious and easy to navigate your way around. Contain, then explain. So from there, I'm conscious that it's not coming up so well for a number of you, but I wanted to get onto the next part of our acronym. So we've covered S, simple, T, thinking, E, emotionally intelligent. The P part of our acronym is practical. This is about making our language practical and accessible and not using jargon. I'd direct you into the research of a pioneering psychologist called Dr. Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner has a great phrase that he uses, that he says, when children leave school, the question society asks them is, how clever are you? When the question we should be asking every child is, how are you clever? Because his point is every child, every person is intelligent. We just have different ways of manifesting it. Some people are verbally gifted, some are socially gifted, some might be musically gifted or physically gifted. But we're all intelligent. But if we only appeal to that certain range of people, how many children leave school thinking they're stupid when the reality is we just weren't engaged? Now, the reason he mentions that is that we have access to a range of intelligences, but what nobody has access to is corporate bullshit intelligence. So when you use phrases like we have a strategy here that we need to execute, or we've got silo mentalities that we need to eradicate, or we need to work with greater synergy, let me be the person to tell you, nobody actually understands what you've just said, because our brain doesn't do abstraction particularly well. Let me give you a really simple exercise that Howard Gardner does. I'd like you to just conjure up these thoughts in your head. I want you to conjure up an image of what Paris, the capital of France, looks like. I want you to stay in Paris and go and have a look at the Mona Lisa. Next, I'd like you to hold in your hand a juicy, succulent orange. So I want you to feel the waxy texture of the rind, maybe the smell of it, the tang of it. Next, I'd like you to hear the first line of the Beatles song, Hey Jude. So if you can just hear Paul McCartney singing those opening bars, that'd be great. And then finally, I want you to come up with your definition of justice. So let's just have a look at what happened there in your head. I don't know if you can see the screen. Just let us know if not. But when I said to come up with Paris, nothing's showing, right?
No.
Well, Paris, I guarantee most of you had an image somewhere of the Eiffel Tower in your mind's eye. When I just come up with the Mona Lisa, you saw an enigmatic smile staring back at you. You all easily imagined holding and smelling an orange, and then you could hear Paul McCartney. I don't know if I can get him up for you, that maybe you can hear him, but you all, there he was singing for you as we went along. But where did your brain go to though when I asked you to come up with the definition of justice? That was the moment I lost you. And the reason I lost you was because justice is an abstract phrase. So your brain had to reach out for something that was practical to understand it. Maybe you saw a prison, the Old Bailey, the court of human rights, but suddenly we were looking at very different pictures because I started to use abstract language. So the point I want to emphasize here is that Albert Einstein had a great quote that said, if you can't explain your point as if you're telling a 6-year-old child, there's a chance that you don't understand it well enough yourself. Which brings us then to the final part of our acronym, the S, the final S. So we've done simplicity, thinking, emotional intelligence, and practicality. The final S is storytelling. I said to you that the blue part of our brain is basically brought together by having a common narrative, a story that binds us. And I don't feel I need to labour the benefits of storytelling to you. I think most of us intuitively, it speaks to us. The challenge is, how do I tell a story? I'm working in a busy trust. I've got lots of demands on my time. How do I tell a story about what is often really pragmatic information I need people to understand? Well, the reality is we all have the capacity to tell a story. The best way I've seen it done is delivered through Pixar, the company that make Toy Story right the way through to Finding Nemo. They're the most successful animation studio in Hollywood history. So the question is, why are they so good? The guys that founded it, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter, would tell you that they just tell brilliant stories. And what they've done is they've codified what a great story looks like. And it's worth us looking at their methodology. What they know is that every film starts with a bluff, and then there are 6 sentences that structure every story that people will remember. So let me share them with you. And we'll do it by taking the example of Finding Nemo. I think most of us have seen that film. So what was the bluff for Finding Nemo? The bottom line up front. Well, Pixar pitched it internally as it was a father and son love story involving fish. So now it's got you intrigued. Let's look at the structure. Once upon a time, there was a widowed father and his disabled son that lived together on a coral reef. Every day, the father used to worry about his son's safety and urged him to stay away from the edge of the coral reef because that was where he perceived trouble to be. One day, the son ignored his father and went to the edge of the coral reef, and whilst he was there, he was captured by divers and taken to live in a fish tank outside of Sydney. Because of that, the father had to confront his deepest, darkest fears and go out into an ocean in a desperate attempt to rescue his son and save his life. And because of that, his son came to recognise that his father wasn't a pain. He just loved him more than anything else on their earth. Finally, father and son managed to reunite, where they go back to the coral reef and live happily ever after. There's Finding Nemo for you in 6 simple sentences. Now, the reason these 6 sentences work is they also contain the steps. So let me tell you a story. Let me give you an example. Let me illustrate the point. Opens people's brains up to a natural way of learning. Then we establish a pattern of behaviour. Every day, this happens. And then we break that pattern. One day, something different occurs. And now we make you think, because we've broken a pattern and you don't know how it's going to get solved. Because of that is mentioned twice. Why? Because the red brain is more powerful than the blue. So we need to give you enough reasons to care. And then finally, we tie it up in a neat ending. So let me use the same structure and explain this webinar, right? Let me tell you a story about why we've all come together on this webinar today. Yeah, every day, especially during this pandemic, you guys have been working incredibly hard on the front line, dealing with other people's needs. One day we decided that we were just going to get offline for an hour and give you a chance to stop, think, reflect, and make you just give you the chance to feel like we were investing in you. Because of that, you feel that the trust is invested and interested in you as a person rather than just a professional. And because of that, you go back to work in helping your patients and treat them with extra care and duty until finally you have the best trust in the UK. I'm making this up. Imagine what you could do with your knowledge and wisdom and experience just by being able to combine all these elements of, first of all, making your message simple, then creating space for people to think, demonstrating an emotional intelligence in the way that you allow people to reflect, practical nature of your language so everyone understands it, and then finally having a common story that unites us. That, in essence, is the steps that I've been sharing with you. And that's something that I would argue is accessible for all of us. So thank you for your engagement. I know we've had technical issues and it's been frustrating for a number of you, but thank you for engaging. Thanks for joining in the chat function and having a bit of a laugh with me. But above all, thank you for the difference that you guys are making. I'll pause there, but I'm happy to pick up any questions if you want to discuss it in more detail.
Brilliant. Thank you, Damian. That's I've scribbled so many notes down, so many sort of takeaways from that. I know we're a little bit pushed for time, but I'm just going to offer the audience an opportunity to ask some questions of you whilst you're on. You can either put your questions in the chat, or if you use the raise your hand function, we can bring you onto screen. So whilst colleagues are doing that, I just wanted to, I'm just going to ask a question myself.
Sure.
In terms of, I was really interested about when you talked about, I think you called it heuristics. Is that the right word? Did I get that right word?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. So I think, is that the same as habits, or is that very?
Kind of. Yeah. So a habit. Yeah. So a heuristic precedes a habit, if you like. So the heuristic is a way of thinking about it, which is habitual but it relates purely to our thinking. A habit then manifests itself in a behaviour. So they're certainly intertwined. Okay,
brilliant. Thank you. We've got some feedback into the chat. Margie said amazing. Thank you. She loved it. Laura said the same. Did you explain what the coffee cup was for?
No, I didn't, because of the technical issues. But I can, if we can get it back up, let me show you why the coffee cup became so simple but profound as an exercise. So the guy was describing Freddie Roach when I was describing meeting him in Los Angeles, and he illustrated the point of saying he drew me a coffee cup, and I showed you the picture I drew that was similar to yourself and Paula's. And he laughed at me, and when I asked why he was laughing, he said, everybody draws the coffee cup in the same way. And I said, well, fine, but what's your point? And he said, well, your question was flawed. He said, well, because what you were asking is, how do I get all the ideas in my head into somebody else's? You were basically thinking coaching was about telling and instructing. And he said, and that's not what it's about. And he said, and I'll show you why I draw the coffee cup slightly differently. I don't know if it's come up on your screen, but he said, I draw the coffee cup like this. And it's basically from above. It's like a three-dimensional version of the way that he draws it. Because the point he was making was, my job isn't to see you as a two-dimensional shape. My job is to see you as the person you are, with the skills, your qualities, and your traits that you already have. And my question is, how do I enhance it? How do I help you enhance it and be better? But to do that, you need to see people as they are, not just as how you perceive them, was the essence of it.
Okay, that's we couldn't, unfortunately we couldn't.
It works better visually. It works better visually. Yeah. Is my explanation.
Perhaps
the point.
What we can do is we can share the image afterwards for colleagues that are on the call, so they can because obviously you were explaining it really well. Some more comments.
Sorry, I was going to just say, I'm sorry to interrupt here. I was going to say, I am conscious that people have been good enough to give up your time here, and if you want to get in touch with me, I'll send you some notes on the back of this. So you're welcome. If you drop me a line, I've got a website just called liquidthinker.com. because I don't want you to be bombarded if you don't want them. But if you go to the contact page there, drop me a line, say that we've just remind me of this morning's session, and I'll send you some notes that complement it, so you feel you've got a reminder. It's like a cartoon version of this content. I'll get it across to you.
Brilliant, thank you. That would be great, and we can support that as well.
Sure.
So we've got some more comments in the chat. Damien, thanks for a great session. Jack says thank you. He listens to the High Performance podcast and this has been extremely insightful, giving him a lot to consider. Everybody's saying thank you. They contain and explain. Very interesting and something that I'll definitely use. Great session, thanks Damien. Really informative session, very interesting and thought-provoking, and a lot that Sian will take away. So really good feedback, Damien, so thank you.
Oh no, thank you.
I'm just going to offer up Paula an opportunity to, looks like she's back on a laptop.
I am for the moment. We're all good, I think. I just wanted to say, well, firstly, thank you, Anne, for arranging this session of seminars, because I think it's it feels luxurious to take a whole hour out of the working day, but it is incredibly useful and powerful, and thank you for what you've done to set up the session. But Damien, my thanks go to you. I think when we sit and think about leadership and teams, it's very easy to think, oh, this is a really big, complex subject. But actually what you've done this morning is to present a very simple set of sort of guiding principles to think about in how you create a high-performing team, and really demystified some of that. And some of the things you were talking about are so straightforward and so simple, and I think it's really important to remind ourselves about that sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
As someone who is not NHS born and bred, what you were talking about in terms of being able to describe something to a 6-year-old absolutely resonates with me, because I sometimes find myself struggling with concepts and thinking, well, I don't understand this, and I'm sure it's not just me. So that is, a really useful takeaway.
Sure.
And I was absolutely, when you were talking about the number of interruptions that we get in an hour and the number of bits of information that we're fed over, every month of the year, thinking, bloody hell, it's someone that managed to get anything done, isn't it? With so much of that stuff, and that's happening for everyone all of the time. And you're right, the ability to sift through all that stuff, keep focused, prioritize, but make sure you're able to do that to support your teams is absolutely invaluable advice. So really interesting session. I'm sorry that we didn't get all the graphics properly, because I think that would have enhanced it even more. Shame we didn't get the conveyor belt to work. But thank you ever so much for your time this morning. I think the audience, by their feedback, have really enjoyed it and found it very useful. And I will have a look at your website. So thank you for sharing that link as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you. The privilege has been mine.
Thank you very much, Paula. And thank you to all the colleagues that are on the call today for taking the time out to join us. We welcome feedback. Feedback is an absolute gift. And if you go to Slido on the screen, we would really appreciate your feedback on this session, but also some ideas and thoughts for what else you would like to see as we continue the programme through the year and into next year. So please take the opportunity. You can hold your camera up to the QR code on the screen, or go to slido.com and put the code in. So feedback is a gift. All feedback is really welcome. But thank you for bearing with us with our technical. There were so many gremlins in the system today, all over. I don't know. I think yeah, I think we'll a learning opportunity for everybody on that one. So thank you. I'm sorry, my Slido's just clicking through. And just to make you aware, as we move into the autumn, our next conversation is on the 5th of October, and I'm really delighted that we're going to be joined by Michelle Clark, and we're going to be talking about transgender awareness. So we're changing the programme slightly as we move into the autumn. We're still going to have brilliant speakers like Damian, but we're also going to bring some of our brilliant local experts in to help support and engage us as we move through the winter. So thank you all for your time and energy today. Really appreciate it. Thank you for Damian for joining us. Thank you for Paula for supporting this session. And please enjoy the rest of your your Tuesday even. I was getting carried away then. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and keep safe. So thank you all very much.